The name of this talk should be What I Really Wish Someone Told Me Before I Did a Bunch of Work in Grad School and Did It the Wrong Way. And so hopefully there's at least one part of this that is new to you, and you'll take away something from it, and maybe it will save you some time, or it will help improve your general life as a grad student, hopefully. So I'm starting with this sort of old comic here where there's like a bunch of equations and then a miracle occurs. And then, you know, that's sort of what happens with your thesis, right? Is they tell you a lot about the beginning, okay, you have to have this great idea, and then they tell you how to present your results, but not a lot of the in-between stuff, right? And there's a lot of stuff, one would say most of the stuff is the in-between stuff. And there's a lot of little just general tips that I would have after being a student for 15 years of my life. Yeah, so just to let you know, I did a 5-year honors undergrad here at Memorial. Then I did a 3-year master's here at Memorial, and Dr. Vardy was my supervisor for that. Some of you may know Dr. Vardy. And then I went to the University of Alberta, where I did, I originally went there to do a PhD to follow up on the robotics, computer vision stuff that I had done with Dr. Vardy. But then when I got there, the professor Michael Burrow, he taught this course on AI and wanted a new student to do some work on AI for real-time strategy games. And I was a complete video game nerd and just switched from robotics over to video games because I knew I would regret it for the rest of my life that I didn't. And then I spent the next 7 years doing that PhD. So it took a long time because I switched after 1 year of work. So I had all that work that I did that was, I learned a lot from it, but it didn't end up directly contributing to my thesis. And then after some funding ran out, I had to work part-time for a while. So it took a little while. So I know a little bit about being a student. I wouldn't recommend sitting there because you might not be able to see. You might want to move over somewhere else. So just a bit of an overview. I'm going to talk about some things, definitely some things you already know about, but some things maybe you don't know about. And even if you do know all of this, I'm just trying to drive home the point of how important it is. So we'll talk about things like version control and backing up your life's work. It's very important. The programming that goes into carrying out experiments, how you should organize that, some little tips for that. I didn't actually include anything on language selection here, but writing documentation, open sourcing stuff, etc. And one of the things that I'm very, very aware of, this is an unfortunate fact of life, unfortunately, is that if anyone in life gives you advice, it's impossible to know if that is actually advice that you should follow until after you've had the experience to know whether or not it was good advice, right? So there's this huge catch-22 is like, who do I believe? Who do I listen to? The only real tip I have for you there is don't listen to anyone who's trying to sell you something. Okay, so if I was coming in here trying to sell you my product to help you with your grad life or whatever, don't listen to that person. Listen to the person who's like possibly lived through something and can tell you what they experienced and then have you judge from there. So you might think I'm exaggerating in some of these things, but I guarantee you that if I stress a point, it's not exaggerated. It has either happened to me or someone that I know about. And you might say, yes, Dave, but firsthand personal experience is the worst type of scientific evidence, right? And I agree with that, but I think if you talk to most researchers, they'll say that this is pretty decent advice. And if I had known it, it would have saved me a lot of frustration over my career. And the first thing that I must stress is version control and backup for your code and for your thesis. It is insanely important because you see things like this online, $5,000 reward, backpack with PhD data, no questions asked, right? People do lose their laptops. People lose their computers. Hard drives die instantaneously. Ask me how I know. So yeah, don't be put in this situation. Here's another one. I'm a Rutgers chemistry 5th-year PhD student. On April 29th, my Lenovo ThinkPad was stolen from room 203. If you stole my laptop and you are reading this letter, I would like to say that you can keep the computer and I will pay you money for my data, right? It's 5 years worth of work. they did not back it up, etc., etc., etc. Do not put yourself in a position to be writing one of these letters. If you have done any work whatsoever, you need version control or backup. So version control is something slightly different than backup, but you can use cloud-based version control as a backup, right? Because version control means I can revert to previous changes and stuff like that, but version control can be used as a backup. So backing up your code, your data, your thesis, it's the single most important thing that you can do. Because yes, there is a low probability that you will lose everything, but you don't want to be that statistic. Please trust me, I have known people who have literally lost years of your life, especially if you were doing something like user studies, where you have to possibly go out and pay people to test your thing, and then you have a bunch of surveys that people have responded to. That sort of stuff is almost impossible to replicate because the people who you got lucky enough to take part in your survey the first time probably either A, won't want to do it the second time, or B, you can't use them again because the whole point of your survey was to judge this thing that they want to use for the first time and then see their reactions to it, right? So another important thing here is that you cannot always replicate the data that you've generated. Yes, if you're just running some algorithm and seeing the output, of course, you could regenerate the data from that, but you can't always do that. So there are these things called the 3-2-X backup rule. The people who work in data centers and stuff know about this. So maintain at least 3 copies of your data. The more copies of your data, the better. So the 3 is maintaining 3 copies of your data. The 2 is using 2 different types of media. So for example, one on the hard drive of your laptop, but another on an external USB drive or something like that. And then keep at least X copies off-site in a different physical location. So this could mean using a cloud-based thing. It could mean I have one USB stick at home, I have one USB stick at work. And trust me, even if you have a backup on a USB stick, if those 2 things are in the same physical location and a fire or a flood happens, they're both destroyed, right? So they have to be in different physical locations or cloud backup. So here's some diagrams of this is the 3-2-1 rule that sometimes people use. Yes?
I just wanted to kind of emphasize that actually that has happened to me. I have had 3 backups and 2 of them died at the same time. So basically.
So in case for the recording, Oscar just said that he had 3 versions of the same data and 2 of them died at the same time. So having that 3rd one was really important. What was the data?
It was just like voltage. So
okay.
Like
what were the 2 storages that died?
how did hard drives?
Hard drives. Oh my God, hard drives are just insane. And here is another type. I think this is 3-2-2, where you have 2 copies in the cloud, etc. So here's what I do for my research stuff. I have 2 physical copies in my home. So one of the physical copies is like the actual copy that I'm working on. That's on my hard drive. It's open in my editor. That's the one that I'm working on. Then I have one backup copy on a local network NAS. So NAS stands for Network Attached Storage, where you have like a group of hard drives in one device. Maybe it's in a RAID configuration or something, and that's attached to your network. So I have a mounted network drive that I can just drag things over and back up to. Every project that I work on exists in GitHub. So, I'm not always a fan of proprietary solutions, but GitHub is it won the repo wars, right? It's the thing where you put all your stuff. So I would recommend using GitHub. So I have public repositories for projects that I would consider either completed or usable by the public, and private repos for things that are currently in progress. Maybe you're doing some, groundbreaking research and you don't want the public to be able to see it, etc. Just keep in mind, and this probably will never make an actual tangible difference, but these repositories that are on GitHub are owned by a company, right? Like you have the copyright to the code, but Microsoft owns GitHub and they can scan your code and add it to their LLMs or their Copilot or whatever. So I have actually had my code show up in a Copilot autocomplete before. And that's because it's such a niche thing, like StarCraft AI programming. and I wrote a function, and it was almost character for character my code. So there wasn't a lot of training data, so it probably just copied my code over. It's probably gotten better since then. That was several years ago when Copilot had just come out, but anyway. Just realize that, but I also know that like almost every company has their code in GitHub, right? So it's pretty secure. You probably won't lose it there. And then I have a milestone-based zip file of backups to some cloud thing, right? So, okay, here is when I ran all my results, I zipped it up and I put it on my Google Drive or something like that. I know you don't always, every time you hit Control S to save, you don't want to have to propagate it to all these different networks, right? If you have some automatic backup solution, that's fine. But, you know, okay, this is the end of the term. I put all my notes in this backup or whatever. And so, and then a yearly backup of all projects to a single archive file on my NAS. So everything in my research directory at the end of each year gets zipped and just put there, and it's like a few gigabytes or whatever, but now I can go back if I need to and see that. Stop emailing files back and forth if you're collaborating with people. Stop using Dropbox for collaborating with people, and stop using Google Drive for collaborating with code, at least. Obviously, if you have, like Google Drive is great for things like Word docs, so Google Sheets and what's the Word version? What's it called? Google Docs. Oh yeah. So Google Docs is great for like, yes, that's great for collaborating on a document, but for code, stop doing that. Even for small projects, use version control, use GitHub or Bitbucket or whatever. Just use Git. It's really good. Cloud-based version control, I would say, is ideal. So GitHub, Bitbucket. Free private repos are available. I think they even have like student plans and stuff. So it's just great. Use that. And cloud-based storage is also good for backup. So Dropbox, Google Drive. I can't believe I put OneDrive there because I hate OneDrive. But at least it's a backup, right? Even if you put it there and you forget about it, it's there pretty much forever. So I would use something like that. Some of the benefits of version control: it's easier to view and edit up-to-date versions of your code on multiple machines, which is nice. So I can write something at home. Like for example, I have these slides I edited this morning on Google Drive. And then I came in and it's just there on my laptop, and it's the up-to-date version of the slides. I didn't have to email them or whatever. I'm sure you all know this and you all use this already, but I'm just stressing it. It's easier to share code or papers or collaborate with others via these cloud-based solutions. It's a free off-site backup of your code. You will look more professional to your peers if you have a nice repo code base going. It's easier to release code as open source. I would highly recommend, if you have created some code for your master's thesis, if it's not some sort of sensitive data, to open source that, right? Maybe nobody will ever look at it, but why not, you know, contribute to the scientific community if possible? I thought no one was going to look at my code at first, and then I wrote something and people started using it, and then I wrote documentation for it to make it easier. Then more people started using it, and a bunch of people around the world have used it, which is really nice. And it's a valuable industry skill, right? Eventually, all of you will have a job somewhere, I hope, and basically everywhere that uses the sort of skills that you have is going to use some sort of version control. So it's better not to walk into that interview and they say, hey, have you ever used version control? And you say no, right? That would look pretty bad at this stage in your career. So I just want to quickly look over here at this. So I have, where is it? So this is my GitHub, where I have all my repositories, and so like all my code is here. I've done some consulting with different companies, and so we have like shared private repos and stuff. But you know, here for example, we go into this repo, which is my most popular one. It was, you know, it hasn't been updated in a while, but here we have all the code as well as a wiki. So a wiki to actually use this. There's documentation. There's a couple of videos. Here's another one over here where if you have something that's kind of complicated to set up, just write this documentation, right? There's screenshots, how to set it up and run it. And if you do, people will actually use it, right? Documentation is something that's important for this. And it takes a lot of time, but it feels worth it to me at the end when you have code that other people actually use. And not only that, Now you have nice software that you can go back to and actually remember a few years later if you need it again. And this is like helping build your online portfolio for your resume or for your academic CV when you go to apply for a job or go to apply for a PhD or whatever, a postdoc. Like all of this is building up your portfolio as well. So it's like, it's a thing that you can do to not only help yourself and save yourself from heartbreak, but also help yourself in every possible way in your career by building up this portfolio. So it might seem like a little bit of work, but it's worth it in the end because you're double dipping, you're triple dipping, meaning you're doing one thing that helps you in multiple ways. On that related note, so are you all thesis-based students? Yeah? So who's doing a master's and PhD? Couple? Okay. So as part of your thesis, you are going to be doing a literature review. So the very first thing you have to do, and hopefully Oscar is going to beat this into you, is do a lit review. Why? Because I knew a guy who was doing his PhD. He was 3 years into his PhD, and his supervisor found a paper from 1985 that did what they were trying to do better. But he couldn't find it online. Someone like that he knew sent it to him, and there wasn't a sufficient lit review. The unfortunate, I guess it's not unfortunate, the hard truth about science and publishing is that second place does not matter. Because if you're second place, nobody can tell whether or not you copied from first place. And first place meaning the person who published it first, right? Because if someone else published it, and then you try and publish it, who's to say that you didn't just copy what they did? Even if you completely independently came up with this idea, it doesn't matter because it already exists. And publishing is about new results, better results. So you have to really go out there and do a good lit review before you do any work. It's no good to say, okay, I've done all this work, I should be able to use it. Unfortunately, if someone else has done it, you can't. Right? So make sure you do that lit review. And as this is more of the, I'm not getting into that too much, but this is more of the practical side of use a reference manager. Does anyone here use a reference manager? Okay, like 2 people. So every time you read a paper, save the PDF because the professor's website that you got it from may go offline. The repository that it used to be in may go offline. The journal that you got it from may cost twice as much when you go to get it again, right? Yes, the library can probably go get it for you, but just save a copy of that PDF and add it to a reference manager. And I'll talk about that a bit more in a sec. Also, back up the references, okay? Because when you go to write your thesis, you're going to need to be able to say, oh, I read that paper once. What's that paper again? And you'll be there on Google Scholar for 3 hours trying to find that paper that you saw once 2 years ago and you can't remember it anymore, right? And then someone who reviews your thesis will be like, why didn't you cite this person, right? And then you're like, oh, I couldn't find it. You will forget papers and authors and where you got them. So buy a reference manager. I mean, Mendeley is like pretty much the gold standard now. It's just an app you can get on your phone. You can log into their website. You can upload PDFs, you can like sort by category, whatever. And so you can copy the BibTeX. Who here has used LaTeX so far? Okay, so as part of your bibliography, you're going to need a BibTeX file. You need the BibTeX refs, and Mendeley can handle all that for you. There's also an older one that I used 20 years ago called JabRef. It's just anything that helps you to manage this data, right, and keep it in one place. And I would recommend that. And like, so I could be at home doing some research. I find a paper, I add it to Mendeley. And then later, I'm at school and I have my iPad. I have Mendeley. It keeps everything up to date. It's a cloud-based thing, and I click it, and now I'm reading that same paper. So that's just a quick note on managing that. So do a thorough lit review to make sure the thing you are going to be doing has not been done before, because it's very, very brutal if you do find it has been done before, and back up all that stuff you've done as well. Any questions about anything so far? Yeah?
Regarding to the frequency that we should back up our data,
Yeah, so the question was, with what frequency should we back this stuff up? With stuff like Mendeley, it's on the cloud. It's probably not going away. I would say, maybe every semester, at the end of a semester, try and download it, get a copy of it somewhere. In terms of code, I mean, you should be saving your local file all the time. And if you are using GitHub all the time, which you should be whenever you're working on code, then that has that secondary cloud-based backup. And realistically, if GitHub goes down, we've got a lot more problems than just your thesis, right? So I would say, realistically, have a local copy of it. Make sure that you're committing it to Git like on a daily basis. Like, don't go home without committing your code. Don't go to work without committing your code. And just think to yourself, how upset would I be if my code was not backed up right now? Right? So again, I don't back up everything 4 times every time I save. That's sort of your thing. If you have just run a huge experiment that took 12 days to run on a supercomputer and you have a gigabyte of output data that you would cry if you lost, immediately back that up to 4 places. Right? So I think it depends on the context, but I think realistically, if you're coding and using version control, and at the end of the day, you back that up to version control, you're fine for your code, but for other data, it may be contextual, how often you back that up. Did someone else? Yeah.
So, but even though so far you think the topic is new and you continue work, in the meantime, in the middle, someone else published similar research, but you haven't finished that.
Yes. So I'm just repeating the questions for the video. The question was, what happens if your thing was new and then you get halfway done and someone publishes and beats you to it? I don't know what to tell you. I think you would have to rely on the advice of your supervisor at that point. Some sort of pivot would have to happen. Maybe you just take a slightly different angle and you're able to publish something that's not quite as fancy as you originally thought, but at least it's still new. I have known someone in like my really kind of small community of research that published something I was thinking about doing, and I just called them because they were at my school when I was at U of A, and I was like, hey, let's work on, you did this, I was going to do that, let's do a third paper together, right? So maybe you could collaborate with that person, because if you're so similar-minded that they literally did what you were going to do, then maybe try and collaborate or say, oh, like, what can I do? It depends on the situation, but I would say your supervisor would have some expertise in that area, possibly know that research group, and give you some advice on what to do. Well, if the end of your research is going to be what they did and published, that's going to be useless. You can't publish it, right? Because you can't be second place. It's unfortunate. Yeah. And so when choosing a topic to study, keep that in mind. Don't be so close to someone else that they might do the thing that you're doing, right? Now, this doesn't happen a lot in practice. I'm talking about worst case scenario. Typically, you're going to be choosing something that you're pretty sure no one else is actively working on. On to the research experiments. You have to do experiments at some point, unless you're like a theory person and you just prove some new concept that exists. I'm not really a theory person, but hey, I proved P equals NP. You probably don't need an experiment for that, right? But most of you are probably going to be writing some code and doing some experience. So most theses that I've found fall into one of 2 categories. Number 1, and these are in arbitrary order, one's not more important than the other. I care about a particular problem domain, so I'll come up with a new solution for it, right? For example, I care about people dying of cancer, so I'll do whatever I can to prevent more people dying of cancer. That's like a domain-specific research problem. The second one is, I came up with a new algorithm or technique that could be applied to multiple domains, and I will use some existing problem domain to test it. So for example, the A* search algorithm, I made some improvements to that algorithm. Now I'm going to test it in a bunch of domains that I may or may not actually care about in order to get better results than the previous versions of this algorithm. So there's sort of domain-based problem solving, and then there's solution-based problem solving. That's how I look at different theses. So some theoretical theses will not require any applied experiments, but in practice I think that's kind of rare. Even if you do prove something, it's nice to have some actual data to back it up. And so in the case of most theses, the experiments will be the key to publication, and publication is the key to graduation, right? Not to get all alliterative on you, but we're here to graduate eventually. So, experiments. Typically, computer science experiments running an algorithmic solution on a given problem, right? I have some data set, I'm going to run some algorithm on it and produce some results. Examples. If you're doing some machine learning, maybe you're matching features in an image. For example, my field of research, which is heuristic search, maybe I'm finding the shortest path through an environment, right? Maybe I'm optimizing a function with some parameters. Maybe I run some model on a data set, and then I have some error rate, et cetera, right? So again, one of two things usually happens. You're either A, going to run your technique on an existing platform and an existing data set, and then compare your new results to the existing one. So if you've ever been to any machine learning talk, what they do is typically the machine learning communities in like image processing or medical data or whatever are going to have these standardized data sets that everyone for the last 10 years has run their model on. You download that, you run their standard suite of tests with the new model and that you've created, and then you compare it to existing results, right? And then if it's better, you can publish it. If it's not, you can try and publish it, but if all you've done is create something that's slower and less accurate, I don't think you're going to be able to publish that. Or the second one, you've come up with some new environment, you run your new method on it, and then you run the old methods on it as well to compare it. So maybe I came up with a completely new domain in which my algorithm performs better than existing ones, and then you would do this. So you must compare your new methods to existing ones, or you can't claim that you have any improvement, right? Now again, theory-based people who show some proof of, okay, you know, this algorithm now runs in n log n time instead of n squared time, they may not necessarily need to run any experiments, but you probably will. So if all you do is run an experiment and say you ran a genetic algorithm and you said, hey, look at my graph. My graph, the line goes down or the line goes up, whatever happens to be better in your field. Okay, your line went up, but did it go up faster than the other one? Right? It's very rare that you have created an entirely new algorithm for an entirely new domain that you cannot compare to something that already exists, right? Even if no other specific algorithm exists for this thing, compare it to a brute force approach where, hey, no other algorithm exists for this, so I'm going to just do a linear scan of everything, try and pick the best one. Or I'm going to try all possible permutations. Come up with something to compare it against, or it doesn't mean anything, right? Theoretically provable improvements usually don't require experiments, but even when they don't, it's nice when they do show something. Hey, look, I saw, I got this improvement from n squared to n to the power of whatever, 1.5, and not only did I show a theoretical improvement, but I ran it on this real-world data set, and it was faster, right? Because sometimes the theoretical improvement rely on some data structure that might take a long time to run or whatever, so it's still good to have experiments in those cases. Showing improvements. How do you actually show improvements? So SOTA is state of the art. How could your methods improve on the state of the art? You've got to improve something in order to be able to publish and say, I'm better, right? And so you don't need to improve on everything. Like maybe you're faster, but you're less accurate. Maybe you're more accurate, but you're slower, right? So you get more accurate results. Maybe you ran faster or you used less memory than existing solutions. Maybe some existing constraints were lifted, right? So maybe I have this new feature matching, image matching algorithm, Oh, by the way, I'll be giving Oscar the slides for this, and the video will be out. So if you're, I don't mind you taking pictures, but I will be giving the slides out. So for example, maybe someone had a great new image matching algorithm, but it only works on apples, right? It doesn't work on oranges. And then you come along and say, hey, this isn't as accurate, but it works on oranges now, right? That's a thing that can happen. Maybe simpler to engineer or implement. This is a tougher thing to sell in a paper, or more cost effective, more industry relevant, right? Like this can actually be run on a non-supercomputer. That's a good thing most of the time. So the experiment must be able to measure whatever metric that you're claiming improvements in. That's important. Parameters. Many experiments are going to require parameter tuning or parameter changing for various reasons. So for example, you might be running a genetic algorithm and you've got a lot of parameters. Who's ever run a genetic algorithm? A couple people? There's like 50 parameters, right? So you've got to be able to save those parameters somehow. In heuristic search, maybe you have some time limit on your search, like I got to run this in 5 seconds. I'm going to get the best results in 5 seconds. Memory requirements, bound settings. For machine learning, you're going to have some data input, a bunch of output stuff, different settings for your model. Results files, graphs, etc., etc. Your experiment code should be able to vary these without editing or recompiling the code. So what this slide is trying to tell you is that wherever you have a parameter that is not directly related to code, have that be in a parameter file, in a text file, JSON, YAML, XML, whatever. Anything like this, like the number of things in the population in the GA, the time limit for running this thing, all of that should be in an external file. I remember, doing a year of my master's thesis. Every time I had to change a parameter, I would change it in the hard-coded code, like, const int mutation rate equals 0.7. Run a new experiment, Dave. Have it be 0.8. Okay, now I recompile it. And now it's like, wait a minute, what experiment did I run yesterday? Was that 0.7 or was that 0.6? I don't know, because I didn't use version control, and I edited and overwrote the code instead of having it all in a settings file that I can save as experiment June 24th, 2006, and then I know what experiment I ran, right? So a bit of a recap. Methods must be tested in a given environment, either existing or new. Results of different methods must be recorded and compared in some way. And experiments may have many parameters, inputs, outputs, and results files that need to be varied quickly or automatically. So all of these things you should take into account. So when you're talking about experiment organization, there's a number of things that you should take into account. One is the experiment problem or environment. For example, I ran a bunch of my experiments in a video game called StarCraft, and so I had to have a copy of that game. All the settings for that game had to be accounted for. The experiment methods and algorithms, so maybe I'm comparing the A-star algorithm to the D-star algorithm, or A-star light, or something like this. A bunch of different algorithms and methods. There's a bunch of parameters and configuration. There's input data, there's output data, there's results that I want to compare to other results, and then there's the other results themselves as well, right? So I've got to have a way to keep track of all this, and you should probably set that up before you've done the third one and discarded the previous ones. All right. Typical thesis workflow. There's a lot of text on this slide, I know, but I'm just going to read it. Step 1, code up a proof of concept algorithm that's really hacky and you swear you'll clean up later, but you never actually do. Right? Is this familiar to anyone? Because it's certainly familiar to me. Test it on a small dummy problem and get decent enough results to go forward implementing it on a real problem. This is all completely valid. I'm not saying don't do this. I'm saying this is this is what happens. Edit the code and recompile every time you want to change the environment, parameters, or input-output file settings. For each experiment, change the code, run the experiment, copy the results somewhere, think of a new experiment, and then repeat. Hopefully throw together some graphs from the saved results, write up the thesis, and thank God you never have to do that again. And then forget what the code does or how to rerun the experiments later. This step will happen to you, right? Even if you've run even if you've written all the documentation and done everything correctly, you will forget. But writing the documentation will at least let you go back and remember. And when you hand in your thesis and your supervisor says, I think we need to rerun experiments 2 and 6, but like double the time limit. Oh crap. How I don't remember how to do that. I don't remember the variable that I used for that, right? Very bad. You're gonna end up going back and probably changing the code in a way that the original experiment wasn't run, and now you're not doing science anymore, right? You're just guessing, you're doing guesswork. Ideal thesis workflow. Carefully plan the experiments that you will need to carry out, what data they will output, and how to visualize them. Write modular code that will allow you to run different solutions on different problem environments. Spend time writing experiment configuration files that allow you to modify the parameters without recompiling the code. Write code that outputs configuration files for all the experiments that you will need to run for your thesis. Run a single documented script that will run all required experiments and output results files in an organized way. And then run a script that generates graphs, tables, and figures from the results file without requiring a GUI. I have another note on this. But being able to regenerate your graphs and figures with a script is incredibly important. I'll tell you why in a bit. Here's the advantages of all this. Configuration files will let you know what experiment was run and how to rerun it later. When your supervisor asks you to modify a parameter and see what happens, you don't have to tear your hair out because you overwrote the version of the code that did that. It will happen. When your supervisor asks you to change the x-axis font on all 40 figures in your thesis, you can do that by editing a single variable in a script and hitting run, rather than crying for hours. Ask me how I know this one, right? I had, like, in my master's thesis, I had maybe like 10 figures. I forgot where the data was. Once I handed in my PDF, that's all I needed to do. And then it was like, no, you can't read the x-axis font. I don't know if that's 1,000 or 100. Go redo those figures. It took me way longer than it should have. So being able to rerun your experiments easily can save your entire thesis or publication by also, not only your supervisor, they're not the bad guy here, they're genuinely trying to make your work better, but the reviewers as well, right? If the reviewer gives you something, like one of the things that I say when I review papers all the time is something like, hey, the figure that you included in this PDF is a bitmap like PNG or JPEG that doesn't scale if I zoom in, right? You should be generating, I didn't put that in here, but another important thing is all your graphs should be vector-based graphics, right? They should be an EPS, they should be a PDF that you can include, and zoom in arbitrarily large and have it not get grainy, right? Or see compression artifacts. And that's my number one thing that I say. I zoomed in and it was just like super low res, so please regenerate those in vectorized format. It'll just be better. Whether or not they do is up to them, but yeah. Experiment repeatability. If you run your experiment again with the same config file and get 2 different results, something is wrong. So not only is this good for all the reasons I've said, but to make sure that your code works properly, right? Repeatability is key in science. We are finding that all these papers from the 80s, 90s, 2000s, like in the past, they're just not repeatable, right? So make sure they're repeatable. Your results shall be reproducible even on different hardware or by different people. Now, sometimes there'll be minor differences in like how floating point numbers are calculated or whatever. That's going to be a given. But they should still produce the same overall result of mine's better by 20% or something like that. Allow, and this is important as well, if you're doing something like a genetic algorithm or machine learning where there is randomness involved, you're like, well, there's randomness involved. How am I going to be able to rerun the same thing? Your experiments should be set up so that you can set the seed for the randomness. So if you don't know how computer randomness works, there's always a seed number, and that seed number controls the random number generator. So you should be able to generate, like, put in whatever seed you want, and then if you want to run it 10 different times with 10 different seeds, you can, right? This is a bit of a more minor point, but it is still important in my opinion. So it takes less time to do a thing right than it does to explain why you did it wrong, and plan ahead, right? You don't want your thesis to be that sign over there. And if you don't have time to do it right, will you have time to do it over? Right? Because you, trust me, you will do something over. So that's just a repeat of everything. Now quickly, an experiment configuration, not a demo, but just showing you an example. So here I have this library that I wrote. So Dr. Vardy wrote this library called Waggle, which is a robotic experiment thing. I rewrote it in C++ and just called it C, Waggle, or Swaggle. And one of my students a few years ago used this for their thesis, and they did some reinforcement learning experiments. So here's just an example configuration file, right? It's super simple. It has like the width, the height, the number of robots, the angular speed, the maximum time steps, the batch size, learning rates, alphas, betas, gammas, whatever you have. That's your experiment. When you run your experiment, you read in that file. When you ran that experiment, you can save it as experiment number 1. Then you copy that file, name it experiment number 2, edit it, and now you've got all the parameters so you can rerun all your experiments, right? It's a better way of doing things. Now there might be, modern machine learning stuff if you're using, TensorFlow and you've got all these graphing softwares. Maybe they have ways of doing that for you, but find some way to do something like this if you can. Visualization. This is second only to backing up your data, I think, is visualization. I cannot overstate the importance of being able to easily visualize your environment, your methods, and your results. Visualizing my results has found so many bugs that I wouldn't have found otherwise. You can have all the results in the world outputted as, here's my average, here's my standard deviation, here's my error rate. But if you can't see that line going up and down and see that one spike in the middle, like what the hell happened there? That's a bug, and then you find it, right? I cannot overstate how important visualizing is. Visualizing my results has yielded more insights and patterns than any statistical data ever did. You need both, because you need to be able to say mine is 1.7% better in this particular environment for the paper, but visualizing it, so important. Visualizing it involves generating graphs or figures or other types of debug output. You could use a program like Excel or Google Sheets to generate a graph, but that's very time consuming. It's sort of a manual process. Every graph involves you doing something manually. Learn a scripted graphing solution. GNUplot is the old school one that I still like to use. Matplotlib, you've probably all seen that in Python. Seaborn is a library that I just learned about, which is built on top of Matplotlib. There are lots of different graphing solutions. Save scripts that you use to generate your thesis figures. Even if your thesis, you think it's going to the reviewers, it's almost done, save those scripts so that you can regenerate all your figures if you have to. This is interesting. This is called Anscombe's Quartet. This is a dinosaur. This is the Dinosaurus dozen. What is the Dinosaurus dozen? It is a group of, it's 13 sets of data that all have the exact same statistical properties. Has the same x mean, the same y mean, the same x standard deviation, the same y standard deviation, the same correlation. All of these data sets. Every single one. So if all you do is look at that data and say, oh, I got the exact same result, nothing has changed. Has it? Maybe it was an oval and now it's an X. I know that this is a bit of a cherry-picked example, but it's for a reason, to show you that your data can change in ways that the statistics do not tell you. Please visualize your data as early and as often as possible to see what's actually going on, right? You may only see, for example, let's say you had this circle, right? Then you run another result, and you're like, oh, the average went up by like 0.01%. It's not like, who cares? It's pretty small. But maybe what has happened is that a bunch of these points went up here, and now there's a little cluster up here. That's an effect that should be investigated. Why do I have this group of data up here now, right? Visualizing is extremely important. How can I visualize? There are a number of different ways. Visualizing the raw data is important, in my opinion. Sometimes you've got so many points that you can't really visualize the raw data. Box plot the data. Violin plot the data, right? As many different ways as you can look at the data, please do so. And if you're using like Python, there's so many matplotlib things that are just like exceptionally easy to do. Visualization data, okay, a demo. I just want to show you a quick demo. This is actually from my 6980 course, where in one of the assignments we do a genetic algorithm. But this is just a demonstration of how important visualization is. This is a genetic algorithm running in JavaScript. It's trying to solve a Sudoku puzzle. That part is not super important. Over here, what is important is in real time, I can see the maximum fitness of any individual in my population, the minimum fitness, and the average fitness. Watch this. If I come down here and increase the number of random genes inserted, in real time, I can see my average fitness dropped dramatically, right? You may also want to ask yourself, let me just put that back. It's probably going to go back up. Yep, okay. Now, let me say, okay, I'm going to turn off elite gene survival. That shouldn't have a real dramatic effect, right? It's just a couple of genes being carried over from, oh my God, what happened? Things that you may not think have a big result are, you can see them in real time, and if you can do that, it is absolutely invaluable to your experience. And look at this. By having a non-zero elite survival rate, I guarantee that my maximum solution always goes up. Okay, so that's something that you could easily interpret in your brain, like, okay, if I'm always taking the best solution and putting it into the next population, then I should never have my maximum go down. That's pretty intuitive. But the thing in your experiment may not be as intuitive. You may not be able to predict what the varying of a parameter will do. And sometimes there's weird thresholds in the parameters as well. Like, oh, I saw this weird result after I went above 10%. Why did I do that? I don't know. You'll have to visualize it to see. Documentation. You will forget how your code works, what parameters mean, how to run your program, the library prerequisites, what the results mean, how to view them. You'll forget almost everything. I was looking through my GitHub repos the other day. Please give me like another 5 minutes if we go a bit over time, because I have like 3 or 4 more slides. You'll forget everything. I have repos on my GitHub that I forgot existed. Entire code that took me a month to write, I was like, oh yeah, I did that, didn't I? It's insane how much you'll forget. Human brains are bad. Write a README file explaining how to set up, compile, run, and view the results of your program. It'll take 5 minutes on the day that you remember everything. It'll take 5 hours on the day that you don't remember everything. Forcing yourself to write documentation will lead to better code and better coding practices. Explaining your code to another person will point out inefficient, redundant parts and make it as easy as possible to set up and run. An actual tangible example, so I had this StarCraft bot, the UAlberta bot that you saw on my GitHub repo, and I'm like, okay, people are starting to ask for this, I gotta write documentation. How do I set up and run this bot? Well, first I need to install this library. Then you need to restart Visual Studio. Then you gotta like install this library in that order, and then do this other thing. And here in the code is where you do this part, but make sure you modify this. And I was like, I sound like a crazy person. This is terrible. I need to make this I need to make this easier so that people can actually use it. And in the process of speaking out loud how my terrible code base worked, I made it better just by writing documentation, right? It's surprising how effective it is when you actually sit down. Now, this is very closely related to the thing people call rubber duck debugging, where if you're trying to debug your code, explain it to a rubber duck, a fictional person. It's very much the same. You will, by explaining how your code works, you'll make it better. Docker. Who has used Docker before? A couple of people. So Docker is a containerizing solution. So Docker containers are essentially, you can kind of view them as little virtual machines, but they're not technically virtual machines. But they're like stripped of everything that you don't need. Okay, they're very efficient. They're essentially how everything runs nowadays. So if I want to run a web server for my company, I have a Docker container that contains all the libraries, all the prerequisites, and I deploy that on Amazon, right? So, and then there's things like Kubernetes and all these other weird things I'm not going to get into. I'm explaining Docker for a relevant reason to you. Your programming project is going to have dependencies. The operating system, required software, programming languages, libraries. Not only that, but your code might work on Python 3.9.127, 3.14159, but not 3.10, like whatever the current version is. So it's annoying. Docker can be used to quickly and easily recreate exact runtime environments. Not only that, but other people can run your single Docker file to completely recreate the entire environment that you use to run your experiments. So, for example, this is an example Docker file. It's for a Python project. And so what you do is there's this thing called Docker Hub that has a bunch of images there. So you're like, okay, this Docker script, it's going to get Python. It's going to install also Python 3.10-slim. That is a nice little Ubuntu distribution, I believe, that has Python installed on it. And what happens is it's a combination of Docker-specific commands and commands that will then be run in that container. So it'll say, okay, set my working directory. I'm going to run, let's update apt, and we'll install Git. Then I'm going to clone the repo where I have all my code onto this container. Then in that repo, I've got some Python requirements, so I'll run pip install on those requirements, and then I will run my script. And anybody in the world who has Docker installed on any operating system, by downloading this text file and running it with Docker, is running your experiment in one command. Okay? Which is insanely cool for reproduction of stuff. Now, it's not only Python, literally anything. Here's just a C++ example. I'm not going to go through the whole thing. It's the same thing, but different, right? So Docker can be a way that if you do want someone to be able to quickly and easily be able to verify or repeat your results, you can use Docker. Now, if you're doing some crazy networking solution where you've got multiple computers talking to each other and stuff like that, you can use other things that use Dockers to set up multiple containers and set up all the networking parameters and stuff. And not only is that good for reproducibility and other people, but it may actually be a better solution than having 3 machines in the lab set up using all this power, etc. So just be aware that these things out there exist to be able to help you reproduce your results, get other people to run them, etc. And hopefully that will help you overall get things published.